not in a room now where Jay's gonna spook
No,
you
he's
again?
working. He's working.
Oh, I
So
forgot about that. That was awesome.
he is at work. Thank you very
Okay.
much. Okay.
Matt, would you do the honors?
Yeah, which one did you want to do?
The cage one.
Nervous.
Okay.
Kate, wait,
So-
why am I nervous? That sounds so intimidating.
So this was actually taught to me by the lady who gave me my vaccine while she was giving me my vaccine, which it was an awesome time. But she said essentially it's an ethics experiment where if it were possible to put somebody in a cage and they would basically suffer on behalf of humanity and humanity wouldn't have to suffer.
Oh my God.
So they would it would be for their whole life. And I'm not positive if this is the way it's initially designed, but I like to think that they're mortal. You know, it's not like there's some immortal being. So basically they can die and we would have to choose another person.
But all of humanity is good if this one
Yeah.
person goes in a cage. Can I choose who goes in the cage?
Well, that's part of it is it would be just a social thing. It would be like part of the world where there's just some dude sitting in a cage, he suffers and humanity is good to go.
But so I can't choose who goes in the cage.
Not specifically. I mean, you might be able to. There might have to be a governing body.
If I say yes, then it's like my fiance is going to be the one in the cage or something, and I'm never going to bring myself. That's what I picture. Because I have seen animes like that. You can't, I know.
Yeah, that's a
I
real
know that if
Twilight
I
Zone
say
plot
yes,
twist.
then Jay ends up in a cage. And I can't.
Well, I
do
think
that.
the way she pitched it to me, at least, it doesn't have that veil of ignorance necessarily where you don't know if it's going to be somebody in your life, and it could be. I mean, that can definitely play a role in it, but I think it's more about just the abstract, the ethics of that. Would it be ethical for one person to suffer on behalf of the many?
I mean, yes and no. Because, let's be real. If they don't, then how many people are in jail cells unjustly right now? You know,
Yeah.
how many people are actually in cages? How many children are in cages?
Yeah.
Too many.
that's a
So if
fair
one
point.
dude has to go in a cage and nobody else is in a cage, I'm for it, but I don't want to be the one to do it. If I
Yeah.
could not have to dirty my hands, I'm all for it. That
Yeah.
sounds awful.
See, and that was my initial take on it too. But then I kind of thought about it more as well, let's say this was just a feature in our world as we know it today. And it's not necessarily one of us picking the person, or it's not even one of us picking the suffering. It becomes an issue of how do we define suffering?
Yeah, how
Who
much
do we
are they
pick? Who
suffering?
picks? And
Yeah.
what happens when that person dies? Does the body or the person who picked the individual to go in the cage remain in perpetuity? What do they do in the meantime? Or do
There's
they
so much
reassemble? So
paperwork
it's
to this.
yeah. But it's interesting because it's if you think say there was a panel that picked, because we all agreed it has to be democratic in that way. Let's say it ended up being the way that our Senate works, where every few years it might be all Republicans or it might be all Democrats. It's going to be a very different person in that cage every so often. And they might be in there for very different reasons that we might not be comfortable with, the person that they deem to be bad enough that they're deserving of this suffering forever might just be someone who believes in equal rights for certain
I don't want to pick.
epochs, So it gets
I don't
really
wanna pick.
tricky,
So, follow-up question. We're assuming that this person is mortal.
Yep.
So, does this imply that after they die, a new person goes in, or is it just a one-time scapegoat? And then
That's
we're
how I
done?
like to think about it. Like I said, I don't know if that's how it was originally composed, but I liked personally to
Wait,
imagine
you
it.
found this out while getting a vaccine?
Yeah, it was nuts, dude. It was a great day. I had a really fun time getting that thing.
Vaccine? What person, what medical practitioner sat there and asked you this?
It was great. I went in I had a little book called The Socrates Express with me, and I was just going to read it in the waiting room after. And the lady who was giving it to me, she was like, holy shit, is that a philosophy book? I was like, yeah, I'm just starting it. It seems pretty good. And she took some courses and she's like, oh man, have you ever heard of this? Do you like doing thought experiments? I was like, yeah, I do. No one in my life does. It's all I do in my head. And we just had a great old time. And
That makes a lot more sense. I thought she was just giving you the poke and then randomly was like, hey, you know what I want to talk about?
yeah.
If you know,
No, but we were in there for a while. We were holding up the line. There was a lot of people there and I gave her the trolley problem. She gave me the cage. And we just went through them both in the little cubicle. And then she gave me the shot. Like, this is before she had given me the shot. So it was a blast. She was a cool lady.
Yeah, that sounds like a rom-com. Your life sounds like the plot of a rom-com.
Okay, so where did we land on this? Is it one and done? Is it Jesus, savior of all mankind, and then
oh my God,
we just have eternity of grace?
Well, they both lead you in very different directions. So, I mean, I think they're both valuable ways of looking at it. Like, I think the culpability of humans and some of the fallibility of humans in this whole situation really comes to light when the person's mortal.
Yeah.
But if they're immortal, then it keeps it kind of abstract and it takes away some of those, functional difficulties that would emerge.
Yeah. Well, because I know a lot of people who would view this in the macro lens and be like, well, Jesus already made this sacrifice and he was the sacrificial lamb, the final sacrificial lamb. And now we no longer have to do any sacrificing of our own. And like, that was. Yeah.
But we're saying, let's say that we needed this. I get that. Like,
if we
I know
needed
people
it again.
that would say that. This is hypothetical.
Where do I stand on this?
I stand on I'm okay with it if I don't have to choose. And if that makes me a bad person, then I guess I'm a bad person. But I know how many people are in cages right now. So it only has to be one. Then
Is it a lottery system?
Oh, that would be interesting. Yeah, lottery might be the fairest.
Yeah, that would be the fairest, but I'm telling you, it would be rigged. It would be rigged for whoever choose would lose someone.
No, I mean, I think you're right, though. Like, that's why I think, like, in a theoretical sense, something like this is way more cut and dry. But when you actually apply human beings to it, it becomes so subjective so fast that it might not work from any perspective. Because even the idea of suffering, how would you define suffering? Because some person that likes to inflict pain and they get pleasure through inflicting pain, you would be depriving them of pleasure if you deprive someone else of suffering. So there's kind of weird angles you can look at it from where it becomes just like, it's kind of like I have this feeling about the death penalty a little bit sometimes where like there's certain ways that you could look at that from like a utilitarian point of view and have it make sense, but we're nowhere near infallible enough as a species to wield that kind of power.
Oh, for sure.
On like an institutional level.
I actually think that like suffering needs to be more clearly defined for this. Because as we're bringing up like children in cages or people unjustly imprisoned, if we put if we put a scapegoat in a cage, whether it's a one-time scapegoat, whether it's mortal or immortal, laying off all of the burdens onto one person and then there's no more suffering. Like if we're talking about sort of the more first world suffering, then no, like let the people suffer.
Yeah, but if we're saying all of humanity.
And then there's also if it would end world hunger, if it would end children being in cages, if it would end injustice, suffering born of injustice, then yes, this would be worth looking into. If it would end, but when you say all suffering, there's a lot of things in there that would be considered suffering that are worth living. And suffering worth enduring as a human. That would be enveloped in that overall umbrella term of suffering that I would be wary of getting rid of.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to define suffering in this case.
Fair. I'd say suffering not as a struggle that makes somebody who they are, but suffering as in like genuine pain. Mm-hmm. Like genuine suffering, not as inconveniences aren't suffering.
Right.
So I'd say as long as it is suffering dictionary definition, world hunger, enslavement, and human rights and justice level suffering, then yeah. But if it's day-to-day life, lacking sleep and things of that, that's not suffering. And if you get rid of that, then you're not really even living, because challenges aren't suffering. So if you get rid of that, then like you're not going to actually be living.
Yeah.
But if it's true suffering, then yes, put that person in a cage. I just don't want to know about it.
Because imagine if this had like a butterfly effect sort of thing retroactively. Imagine if like this happened and someone was scapegoated. And as soon as that's enacted, retroactively, you see what would have happened if that applied to all of mankind. And then suddenly there is no art in the world. You know what I mean? Like, that's what I mean. There's if this applies to no one would ever have the chemical imbalance that causes clinical depression anymore. Like, fuck that.
I want my imbalances.
And I know how much people struggle with that. I know how much I've struggled with that, but I would want to keep that around because for some people, it is maybe not beneficial isn't the right word, but like you get something out of it. You know, again, suffering worth enduring. You would see a very different world, though, if that chemical imbalance still existed, but retroactively and in the present time as well, hunger was solved. Or, you know, the criminal justice system made sense and has made sense for all time. You know what I mean? There would probably be a lot more people occupying the planet.
Yeah. But it wouldn't be a problem because they wouldn't be suffering. They'd all have enough food, like we'd have enough resources.
But there would still be those people who were just plagued by kind of general human condition things. There would still be people plagued by desire. There would still be people plagued by mental illness, but maybe not suffering wrought of systemic injustice.
Well, and then there's like, Ali, you made a good point with like the idea of you don't know about it. Like that changes it too, because it totally does. Like, especially if you look at it kind of more like a utilitarian or something, where it's like, it might be just from a lot of vantage points, morally wrong in the context of what's happening to that person, but it's leading to the well-being of every other person in the world.
I'd like to imagine if in an alternate reality they're debating the opposite thing. Do we get rid of the few people that are suffering for the world to suffer? Because that's the thing. You never know. We don't know what the world would be like without suffering. That's all it's ever been. So if there was a world with no suffering and everyone was so obnoxiously happy all the time, and that became utilitarian, and that became, you know, a dystopian society, then there'd probably be some Katniss Hunger Game thing going on where it's like, we have to free the man in the cage, free the man in the cage. Right. And there'd be a whole thing like that, you know? So either way, we're humans. We're going to mess it up somehow, I'm sure.
Well, because also if it's
I know that's a depressing thought, but.
And if it's a lottery system, it becomes Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, where there's going to be suffering because you're always going to be in fear every year or however many years that happens, you know, like if it, especially if it's not a one-time thing. And, you know, as soon as the first mortal scapegoat passes on, then we choose another one. Like, then you're going to be always in fear that it'll be you if it's like a draft system. So then inherently there's going to be suffering because who's the next sacrifice?
We're plotting the next young adult sci-fi novel.
Well, essentially, yeah. There's $1 million in here somewhere.
Let's be real. That's what it is, then.
Yeah.
This concept is weirdly close to so many sci-fi plots too. Like, it's not exactly, but I mean, it aligns pretty well with like stuff like The Giver a little bit in a different kind of a way. Like this is totally a fear. Like, this must be just like an age-old fear.
Giver Hunger Games.
Yeah.
It's Girl with the Gifts meets Giver meets Hunger Games. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for the plot of the next book. All right.
I'm just trying to tie this concept back into not Christianity necessarily, but like the story of Christ. Like, if this was successful, right? If it was a one-time scapegoat and then suffering is done, like the kind of suffering that we can really do without, and then that is recorded in history as something that worked, and there's some kind of a danger of there being an ideology, kind of a danger of there being passed on this concept that we can, at any point in time, if suffering returns, we'll just pick another human to sacrifice to that cage. And then like what kind of legend arises out of that? Like, I think we've been thinking about this in like, how would we view it in real time? Like, if someone was right now taking on all that suffering, taking on that burden for all of humankind, and we knew about it, we'd be fine with it. But then what happens when that passes on into legend? And what happens when it becomes an ideology? Because inevitably it will, because we're humans and we're dumb. So this kind of story in perpetuity, this kind of story like canonized into history books.
I think there'd be some that revolt.
Yeah.
There'd be some that would be like, free the man in the cage, and then there would be others that are like, worship the man in the cage. I don't know. I feel like there would be, you can make a cult out of anything.
Well, yeah, you really can.
You really can. So I feel like there would be churches revolving around it, and I also feel like there would be a lot of revolting and rebelling against it. But if suffering isn't allowed, then I'm not saying there'd be violence against each other if there is no such thing as suffering.
Well, because that's the other thing is then who, from that point on, who defines suffering?
Yeah.
If we're saying it ends a certain kind
Man,
of
this is
suffering,
hard.
I know. But if it ends a certain kind of suffering, a few years go by and then someone's like, you know what? I desire something and I don't have it, and therefore I'm suffering. That thing didn't work. We need to sacrifice more people. You know, so I think and that's how those cults might form, because someone's going to decide that they are unhappy and someone's going to decide that there's still injustice applied to them. That is way less impactful, way less harmful than the suffering and the discomfort that the people who felt it and whose burden was eased had been feeling prior to the sacrifice, right? But then there's always going to be somebody who takes the privileged position or the entitled position of saying, well, I don't have this. I want to have it. This worked in the past. Let's make it work again. And then a cult arises, or a movement arises, or an ideology arises over how you can fix suffering in the world by sacrificing people. And then the committee forms, and the committee determines who's going to be sacrificed based on ideology and not based on lottery. And then a hierarchy forms around that committee and around that process. So the problem is when something like this works, or there's evidence that it can make people's lives better, or that certain people were satisfied with it enough so that it becomes canonized or it becomes law, that the most entitled and privileged people, or the most influential people, are going to form a hierarchy and an ideology around that thing. And then it becomes law. And that's what I'd be most wary of.
So we'd mess it up somehow.
Yeah. That's how I feel.
Is this a book already? Is this a book?
Yeah, is it?
Should be a book. Is this a book? Like,
Well, actually, I want to look up who came up with the original thought experiment real quick.
Yeah, that would be interesting to know.
I'm looking it up.
Wow, don't just Google man in a cage. Gotta say thought experiment.
Don't worry, I didn't. I added thought experiment to the end.
That's a good call. That's not what I did.
So the question is your vaccinator, was this just a dream?
Well, like, I'm honestly wondering if
I wonder.
she made it up, or if like a teacher that she had made it up, or like if it was more original. Because we were talking about like Kantian stuff at the time, but I'm not finding it anywhere. So,
I mean, were you just visited by a spirit, do you think?
it's possible. I mean,
No, I've heard something similar, but there's been some kind of sci-fi movie of like, would you kill one person to save yourself? Like there I know for a fact I've seen something like that. It's okay. I'll just write the book and then we'll have it to reference.
yeah.
I wonder what happens
we
if you
go.
Google human sacrifice thought experiment. This is going to get dark.
Be wary, Joel.
Oof, the first result is human sacrifice and human experimentation.
Yeah.
Okay, third one down is the trolley problem. It knows what I'm getting at. Is it okay to sacrifice one person to save many? It is kind of the trolley problem, but
Yeah.
like different in that,
But
like,
suffering, it's
suffering
not
is different
life
than
versus
lives.
life. It's
Yeah.
This is different. This is fancier.
Yeah. And I mean, like, really the root of all, especially all religious ideologies, has been, this is why we suffer, and how do we appease the being which makes us suffer. So I really feel like there's no way that this could happen just one time and not turn into an answer that people turn to in perpetuity, and not just seen as a one-time thing. That, because again, suffering will just arise. And I mean, you'd like to think that like necessarily this would be some kind of magical force, right? That overtook the world. So maybe that force would prevent people from corrupting this idea and using it to bend the world to their will. But I don't know. This doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah, I feel like the human element is important to this one, because the idea of human suffering is so inextricable from what it means to be a person. So human judgment should have to factor in on the other end as well, or else it's just kind of a panacea, which is like, it's a pretty clear, I think at that point it would be pretty clear, because we'd be like just totally taking our hands off the wheel and everything would be cool. And then it's almost unethical to not do it, because it's like, well, are you going to be the one person who knows better than the mystical force and stands in the way of humanity potentially not having to suffer anymore? So it kind of inverts it that way.
I think as fair a question is, should we rely on magic to solve systemic problems?
Yeah. Very relevant.
No, but
I don't think the answer is it would be nice, but then we learn nothing. It's like cheating on the test. Yeah. Cheating on your homework.
ending all human suffering equated to cheating.
You can't just copy the answers, because you won't learn anything.